We're now going to take a look at activity-based costing systems. This is a very, very important topic to understand. It has come up already on the CFE, lends itself very well to cases. So again, decent probability it could be tested. Focus of activity-based costing is on the activities that make up products or services rather than the products or services themselves. So at the end of the day, what we recognize when we use activity-based costing is that in order to produce something, produce a product, or provide a service requires a number of different activities. So with activity-based costing, the base for allocating cost is the activities themselves. Once we allocate cost to the activities, then we simply need to add up the cost we allocated to each of the activities to come up with the total cost of production or the total cost to provide the service. So the key to activity-based costing, the crux of activity-based costing, is figuring out the cost driver that drives the cost of each activity. Here are some examples of cost drivers. Let's say, for example, we're dealing with supervisor salaries. Probably what drives supervisor salaries is the time spent by the supervisor. Depreciation and maintenance, basically, you would think would be driven by machine hours. The greater the number of hours that you run the machine, the higher your depreciation, the higher your maintenance. What drives the cost of quality inspection? Probably the number of units that need to be inspected. Equipment setup, what drives that cost? Probably the number of times we need to set up the equipment. So you can see that there's a logical cause and effect here. The driver causes that basically what you're really doing over here is you're saying what causes this cost. So in the case of equipment setup, what causes the cost is how many times I have to set up the equipment. So that would be the driver. For product promotion, maybe the number of products that need to be promoted might be the driver. Now again, you may have to use common sense to come up with a driver, or even more likely, they will hint to you what the driver is. Quite a good chance that if you read the case carefully, they'll tell you what the driver is for each activity, and then you'll simply have to use that driver. Again, it could give you a situation where you have to come up with it, but quite possibly, you'll just have to read between the lines to see what the drivers are. It's unlikely they'll use the word driver, but they may hint at it very strongly. So they may, without using the word driver, hint very strongly at the fact that what drives equipment setup is the number of times the equipment needs to be set up, even if they don't use the word driver explicitly. They could use it explicitly, but even if they don't, they'll likely hint at it quite strongly. Once the costs are allocated to activities, then at the end of the day, you simply add up the activities to come up with the cost of the product or service. Now, it's overhead that you typically have to allocate. So really, activity-based costing really is used to allocate overhead, because direct material and direct labor, you don't have to worry about allocating. You don't need activity-based costing. I can directly trace how much material I used. I can directly trace the amount of labor I used to produce something. It's the overhead where I need a basis for allocation and for which activity-based costing can be very helpful. Now, on this page here, I'll just very quickly go through the different levels of activity. You've got unit level activities. These are activities that are performed each time a unit is produced. So the greater the number of units I produce, the greater amount of power used. Let's say I'm trying to see what drives my cost of power. Here, the number of units produced might affect the amount of power I need to use. Then you've got batch level activities. These are activities performed every time a batch is produced. So every time I start a new batch of production, I have to set up my equipment. So at the end of the day, equipment setup would be an example of a batch level activity. Then you've got product level activities. These relate to specific products, and the cost doesn't correlate at all with how many units I produce. So for example, design of product or advertising of product or engineering efforts to design a routine for different products. Here, basically, what drives it here is not how many units are produced, but the number of products, right? The greater the number of products I want to have, the more time and money I need to spend on design of products. It doesn't matter how many units I produce. That doesn't affect the design of the product. But the number of products that I want to produce, that will certainly affect the cost of design of the product. You've got customer level activities that relate to customers, like sales calls. And then you've got what we call organization sustaining activity. These are activities that are not related or consumed by, not related to or consumed by a particular product or service. So they don't relate specifically to product X or service X. Rather, they relate to the overall organization. So the cost of providing a computer network or a corporate accounting department, those are the organization sustaining activities. Now, just one term you should be familiar with when you're doing activity-based costing, and that's the term activity cost pool. An activity cost pool is a pool in which all of the costs relating to a particular activity are pooled. So all the costs relating to setting up equipment would be pooled into an account. So we know the total cost of setting up the equipment. You'll see in a moment that in order to use activity-based costing, you need to know the total cost for that particular area. And we'll see that in just a moment. What I'd like to do now in order to clearly demonstrate how activity-based costing works, I'd like to contrast it with your traditional non-activity-based costing methodology. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to give you an example of just your standard traditional non-activity-based costing system, and then we can contrast that with activity-based costing. I just want you to be able to, I think you'll understand activity-based costing system better if you have something to contrast it with, and we'll contrast it with your traditional costing system, traditional way of allocating overhead. Let's assume we have a company that has two departments. Total overhead cost in the two departments, $925,000. Now, let's assume this is the number of setups of machinery in each of the departments. One department is casting, the other is machining. I've given you the number of setups. I've given you the machine hours in each of the two departments, casting and machining, and the direct labor hours in each of the two departments. Let's assume in my example that this is the total cost of supervision, maintenance, plus depreciation for casting, and the total cost of supervision, maintenance, plus depreciation for machining is $521. If I was just to use traditional non-activity-based costing, what I would do is I would simply say to myself, what are my total, for each department, what are my total overhead costs? So for casting, it's 404. And then I would come up with just one basis for allocating all of my overhead. I don't care if the overhead emanates from supervision, maintenance, or depreciation. I would just use one driver, so to speak, for all of my overhead. So I might decide that for my casting department, I'm going to use labor hours. So I'm going to allocate overhead based on number of labor hours used on each job. So if my total overhead costs are $404,000, which you can see here, and let's assume that for the casting department, total labor hours for the period is 32,000. I simply take total overhead divided by total labor hours to come up with an overhead rate of 1263. And I'm going to allocate all of my overhead based on that rate of 1263. I'm not going to distinguish differently. I'm not going to come up with a different way of allocating supervision versus maintenance versus depreciation. I'm just going to take my aggregate overhead and allocate it based on one driver, in this example, labor hours. For machining, I'm going to take my total overhead, 521,000. If my expected total machine hours for my machining division is for the period is 22,000 hours, I'll take 521 divided by 22,000, and I'll use an allocation rate of 23.68 per machine hours. So in one department, I'm allocating all my costs based on labor. On the other one, labor hours in machining department based on machine hours. So let's say I've got a job, we'll call the job L890. So all I would do is the following. For the casting department, I'm allocating based on labor hours. So my labor hours for the casting department, was 120. So I'm simply going to say, since this particular job required 120 labor hours in the casting department, I will simply take my rate of 1263, which is my rate per labor hour, and I will multiply by the number of hours in the casting department required for this job. Every job needs to go through both casting and machining. So for this particular job, it required 120 labor hours in the casting department. The rate based on allocating the casting department's cost based on labor is 1263. You see that right here. So I would simply take 1263 times 120 labor hours, and that's my total allocated forecasting. This is my total allocation of casting cost, casting overhead cost to this particular job. Now, for machining, we're allocating based on machine hours. The machine hours for the machine department are basic. The machine hours for the machining department was 110 hours. The rate we came up with for the machining department by taking 521,000 divided by 22,000 was 23.68 per machine hour. So I take 23.68 per machine hour times the number of machine hours that this particular job used in the machining department, and I get 2,604, and this is my total cost. So all I've done is I've allocated all of the overhead costs for the casting department based on labor hours, all of the cost for the overhead costs for the machining department based on machine hours. Very, very simple, but not terribly scientific. The activity-based costing system is far more logical and scientific. Here I say to myself, what are the activities that are required in each department? Well, each department requires supervision, depreciation, and maintenance. Then I say to myself, what exactly drives the cost of each of these individual components? Well, let's assume in this example that supervisors spend most of their time supervising the setup of the machine. So I might say to myself, you know what? I'm going to allocate supervision based on setup hours. So if a particular job in the casting department requires a lot of setup hours, I'll allocate more supervision cost to that job. Then I'll ask myself, for depreciation and maintenance, what drives the cost? Well, I would think that what drives the cost is probably machine hours. So bottom line is I'm going to allocate depreciation and maintenance based on, or the driver for machining and maintenance is going to be machine hours. That'll be my basis for the allocation of depreciation and maintenance. So what I need to do for each activity is figure out a rate that I'm going to need to use. To come up with a rate for each activity, I take the total cost associated with that activity divided by the total number for that driver. So, for example, for the casting department, we're expecting the total casting setup hours for the whole department to be 4,242. We're expecting the total cost for the period for that department to be $280,000 for supervision. So I take $280,000 divided by 4,242 hours to get my $66. And I would do the same thing for depreciation. I'd ask myself for the period, what are my total depreciation costs going to be for my casting department? What are my total hours going to be? Total machine hours going to be for that department for the period? 10,765. I take 45,000 divided by 10,765 to get my 418. And I would do the same thing for maintenance. And again, I would do this. These three numbers here are for the casting department. I would do the same thing for the machining department. Now let's take a look at how we come up with the cost for job L890 using activity-based costing. What I would do is the following. When it comes to supervision, we said that we would allocate based on setup hours because that is where the supervisors spend more of their time. So if they work on a job that has a lot of setup hours, they'll spend more of their time on that job. So we want to allocate more cost of supervision to that job. So I have to ask myself, for the casting department, okay, for job L8, for this particular job, I have for job L890, let's assume that 8 hours were required for setup. So what I would do for that job is I would allocate for that particular activity, setup for supervision for the casting department, I would take 8 hours times the rate we calculated on the previous page, $66, and 66 times 8 is 528. So I'm going to allocate $528 to the supervision activity for the L890 job. Why? Because supervision is being allocated based on setup hours. So I took the setup hours for that job times the rate for that, times the rate for supervision for casting of $66 to give me the 528. And then for machining, guys, all I would do is, for machining basically, we came up with a different rate. For machining, we took 365,000 divided by 18,250, and we came up with a $20 rate. So for machining, I would take the machine setup hours, and I would multiply by those 9 hours by the $20 I just showed you right here, in order to come up, with my 180. And then I would do the same thing for depreciation and maintenance. I think it's pretty straightforward. Let's take a quick look at depreciation. For depreciation, we're using machine hours. So in the casting department, the machine hours were 68 hours. So what I would do is I would take my 68 hours and I would multiply it by the 418, which is the rate per machine hour that we're allocating for depreciation activity for the casting department. So 418 times 68 hours gives me my 284.24. I'm not going to go through all of these because it's going to be the same idea. I look at the number of hours multiplied by the rate for that activity for that department. I then add the cost of all these activities together to get my total cost. So the advantage of activity-based costing is that the costs associated with products are much more accurately reflected in the costing model because it's much more logical. When I did traditional costing, I was really arbitrary. I didn't pay attention to the individual cost. I just took my total cost of 404 for casting, my total cost of 521 for machining, and I used one driver to allocate all these costs. The truth is, labor hours have no impact on maintenance or depreciation, but it doesn't matter. I'm using my labor hours to allocate my cost for the casting department for all of my overhead. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. In the other example of the machining department, I'm using machine hours to allocate all of my overhead costs, although machine hours may have nothing to do with supervision. So it's much more arbitrary than activity-based costing, where I logically ask myself, what is driving the cost of each activity? And it gives us a much, much better understanding of the factors that cause the overhead to occur. So at the end of the day, guys, the key element in activity-based costing is that we come up with good, logical cost drivers, and that actually drive that particular activity's cost. And then I accurately compute the rates based on based on using an accurate figure for the total cost divided by the total units for that driver. That completes our discussion of activity-based costing, a very important topic. But before we leave this topic, we've gone over the technical. Let's just take a quick look at how it's tested on the exam itself. This topic could come up on the CFE in situations in which you need to calculate the cost of producing an item, and the company is using an activity-based costing system to determine cost. This was the case in a legacy program on the SOA exam. That was an exam that used to exist in the legacy program. This has also come up in this way on the CFE. Similar to the case of job and process costing, I think it's quite likely you won't necessarily be asked explicitly to calculate the cost of production using activity-based costing. They could ask that, but very possibly they won't. Rather, you may need to calculate the cost as part of a larger issue. So, for example, the company is losing money, or the company isn't as profitable as was expected, and you're trying to identify the cause. You may need to look at the profitability of individual products based on price less cost to identify which costs are losing money. If activity-based costing is called for, it's quite likely that the cost drivers will be fairly explicit. But so very possibly, as I mentioned earlier, they will tell you what drivers to use, or they'll hint at it very strongly. However, in theory, the CFE could give you a situation where you need to use some judgment in determining what's driving the cost. So more likely they'll give it to you, but be prepared for a situation where you have to use judgment to come up with a logical driver. And again, just use common sense for that. There won't be a right or wrong answer because there'll be judgments involved. And as long as you choose, if you have to come up with a driver yourself, as long as you choose a reasonable driver using good judgment, and more importantly, or not more importantly, but equally importantly, you explain why you chose it, you'll be perfectly fine. So if they don't direct you to what driver to use, two people might end up using two different drivers, but as long as both are reasonable, and as long as the candidates clearly explain their reasoning, both of them could do extremely well. That concludes our discussion of activity-based costing.